In chapter 5 in your discussion forum, I asked a question about or related to the break-even analysis and using a break-even analysis to help you to determine whether or not you should pursue an MBA. And for some of you, I asked this important question, whether or not all the costs and benefits associated with an MBA can be quantified, can i.e. be put into financial numbers. And many of you answered and suggested that there were costs and benefits that you just couldn't quantify, that were relatively intangible, like loss of time with family, or in terms of benefits, the prestige that you would get from an MBA. The reason I bring this up is because when you look at the different decision models that were presented to you in Chapter 6, you can easily see that decision making within an organization can be very complicated and problematic based upon one, the ability to gather information, two, the ability to quantify to some regard that information, three, the ability to use that information, and four, and perhaps most importantly, the availability of that information, i.e. the uncertainty or the risk associated with making a decision and the information that one can have and the access to information one can have to make that decision. So that's why I wanted you to start thinking about it as we look at these different models. And the three models that are presented in your text are by no means an exhaustive list, if you will, of all the decision-making models or processes that have ever been identified. However, I think it's a very good, succinct, and comprehensive approach or compartmentalization or categorization, I should say, of the different approaches. So we're going to look at these a little more in detail. The first one is this classical approach to decision, classical model of decision making. And this one is heavily dependent or heavily tied to economic rationale. What is economic rationale? Well, within the confines of the organization, the focus or the fiduciary responsibility of an organization is always argued to be maximizing stakeholder wealth. And so with a classical or economic model to decision making, what we are assuming is that the manager is making decisions based upon trying to promote or maximize shareholder wealth. And so what the organizational manager is doing is trying to identify the alternatives and identify the decision that is going to just do that, make the owners of the firm as wealthy as possible, of course staying within legal and ethical boundaries. This economic or rational model rests, however, on a few assumptions. One, of course, is that the manager is going to act rationally, that the manager does not have any type of self-interest or alternative pursuits wherein they're going to determine something that's not in the best interest economically for the firm and its owner. So it assumes that the manager, once he or she has identified the most rational alternative, is going to choose that one. Okay, now that's a relatively safe assumption, although of course we recognize that individuals don't always pursue the most rational objectives or decisions. But the other assumptions are a little more complex or questionable. And the second one is that there has to be a high level of certainty. And what do we mean by that? This high level of certainty means that the organizational manager, when making the decision, has a wealth of information, relevant, accurate information on which to base decisions. Because that's really the only way that you can be, fully sure that, fully certain that you're pursuing a rational approach, in that you have this information available to you. Now, again, theoretically, that sounds very plausible. Managers do, especially in today's environment, do have access to a lot of information. But what you have to recognize, and you should recognize even when you looked at an MBA break-even analysis, is that some of that information, although it is available, may not necessarily be certain. You're using forecast, you're using past data, you're using what-if scenarios. And so while you may have information, it may not necessarily be certain, and that questions the accuracy of it. The other issue is an issue of time. Okay, when making decisions like this, or within an organizational framework, managers have to oftentimes make decisions very, very quickly. And the reason why is that if you stall on decisions, if you wait, if you try to get all the information possible and come up with this rational approach, then that time that you're doing that can often be or can often sacrifice your future success, because while you're doing this analysis, your competitors are actually bringing out products and services, making moves that are going to affect your ability. There's countless stories of organizations that have waited and have tried to kind of get everything in a row and be certain, increase the certainty of their decisions. And while doing that, have lost have lost opportunities because their competitors kind of went into the market before. Now, that does not mean that you should obviously act haphazardly and there is no benefit to analysis. Of course there is, and you should do as much analysis as you can, but you have to consider the timeliness of your decisions as well as your ability to improve the certainty of your decisions. You have to know when to act. And you don't want to, you've heard this cliche term, you don't want to have a paralysis by analysis. But that's the rational model. It assumes that you're going to choose the most rational alternative based on the one that maximizes shareholder wealth. And obviously, again, assumes that there's a certain level of certainty in the decision making and that you have access to all necessary information. In very simple cases, in very simple decisions, routine decisions, all of those assumptions may hold. But in most complex decisions, most major organizational decisions, that rational approach seems to be more theoretical than practical. And that's kind of why you have Herbert Simon introducing this other approach. This one can argue it's called a satisficing approach to decision making, and in that approach, the administrative approach is what your text calls it. In that approach, Simon argues that managers don't necessarily, although they want to act rationally, they don't have either the cognitive ability, i.e., they cannot process all the information that is available, and secondly, they either don't have access to all the information necessary, or they need to act in a timely fashion that does not allow them to have or to process all the information. And so he brings a more personal approach to decision making, a more, I guess, realistic approach to decision making. He says, so many times while managers start off with this great intention of kind of, getting all the information, doing this thorough analysis, ensuring that they look at every piece of information and come up with the alternative that is going to economically be most beneficial. He says in the real world, that's not going to likely happen. And you even saw that in your MBA decisions, that you can go back and forth and try to get all that information. At the end of the day, Simon is saying that most managers aren't necessarily going to choose a decision that's purely based on rationality. Instead, they're going to choose an alternative that they believe meets what was called this minimum criteria. So it kind of, it's good and it's suitable. It might not be the best, but it'll do. And my wife and I, we always use this term, it's not the best, but it's good enough. And that's kind of what Simon's arguing, that a lot of times companies are faced because, and again, this is not because their managers are lazy or they just want to make these gut decisions. It is simply because of the nature of the decision, the nature of the environment, the complexity of the decision, the uncertainty of the decision, the lack of information, and the lack of time in which to process them, and even the cognitive ability. All of those things limit the manager's potential to be purely rational. And so instead of just kind of making it a very, very scientific decision, they choose for this satisficing approach. So that's the administrative. And the third is really the one that sometimes, a lot of people say kind of wins in organizations. And that's the political approach to decision making, where you're not going out there really to just maximize shareholder wealth. There's no real objective there. There's no kind of clear-cut way that you're going to make a decision. Your decisions, what you decide upon, what issues become relevant, what solutions are put forward, who gets involved in the decision making, who doesn't, who gets exempted. It's more of a political type interface. And when we say political, we're not talking about government here. We're just talking about people's influence and their agendas being placed and impacting the decision making process. It's a lot like what if you have the opportunity, do some research on what's called a garbage can model, where there's no kind of clear cut, as your book described, this clear decision making process that we start off by gathering information, we identify alternatives, we evaluate the alternatives, we implement, and then we assess the alternatives, we implement, and then we evaluate the result. That's really congruent with a rational approach, and to some regard a satisfying approach. But in the garbage can or the political approach, that doesn't happen cleanly like that. Political agendas, people's, what people are saying, who's powerful, who's not, that kind of gets in the mix, and that helps us to determine what we decide upon, what even do we make decisions, what issues come to light. So that's something to think about. Again, what I hope you're learning in this class, that we have all these great theories, we look at the world in certain places, and we kind of, assume certain things, and we put forth certain things and say, okay, this is the perhaps best approach. But in the real world, things get a lot muddy. It gets a lot complex, a lot more complex than than theories would have you think. And then so you have to really realize that a lot of times what you see more so than just these pure approaches are almost a mixture to some degree. Some rationality mixed with some administrative and a little dose of political. Okay?